How to build a physique program. So we're going to run through the most important steps of building a program for your physique, for development. We're not going to be able to get through everything today, but the goal is to give you a look at the lower hanging fruit of the things that you need to think about with your program to maximize your progress. So we're going to kick off with what all good programs should start with, and that's the needs analysis, because that gives us direction to our programming. It's why we take that leap from something that's cookie cutter, downloadable off the internet, and we want something that's more specific for us and our goals. So the things that we need to consider are, where do we want or need that development? So what does that mean? Some people will need development to bring up their physique from a symmetry perspective, and then some people will want development in a specific area. So a good example of someone who maybe wants development in an area that maybe isn't symmetrical is someone like a female, maybe like a wellness competitor, where their legs are heavily more developed than their upper body. That is an example of knowing what that person would like and matching the program for that outcome. Then we need to think about other considerations like training status and skill level. So how long have they been training for and how good are they at training? Because that will give us an indication of what exercises we select, some considerations for volume and other things in the future. Then we also need to think about the equipment that they have access to, maybe what time they train, what gym they go to, how busy it is, those types of things. And then, do they have a set frequency and training split preference? So how many days can they go to the gym? And do they have a preference of, like, push-pull leg, for example, upper lower? Because we need to make sure that we're meeting in the middle of what that person likes to do and maybe what they need to do. So from here, we can start the process of building a program. So then the next step we go from is what we just spoke about, is the frequency and the split. So how often can that lifter train, or do they need to train? The goal with frequency is to train often enough to yield the adaptation that we want. So frequency works up until a point. Generally around two exposures a week seems to be the best, especially if we're trying to build a physique and grow muscle. Beyond that, you can experience a little bit of progress, but that's at the cost of maybe looking at other things like your recovery. And sometimes the benefit of increasing the frequency beyond 2 just doesn't become worth it, because what you have to do in order to recover just isn't worth the extra adaptations that you're going to get. Now, we want to design this program so the lifter can go into the gym, train, and feel recovered and doesn't have any effect from the previous session. So here's some examples we have here. We've got an example 4-day training frequency where maybe we're doing like upper lower, then we have a day off, then we have an upper session, a day off, then a lower session, and a day off. So we have adequate amounts of breaks between those sessions to make sure that that lifter is recovered. And then we have an example of a 5-day frequency here where we might do, say, push-pull leg, have a day off, do an upper session, have a day off, and then do a lower session, for example. Both of these scenarios are somewhat based on that lifter and their goal and their preference of being in the gym, and then also making sure that they go into the gym feeling as recovered as they can. Now we need to consider training volume. So I can tell you now, there is no set total training volume across the week that we can assign every single lifter. It is very fluid, it is very personal, but what we know is you will need more than most likely what you're doing at the moment, up until a certain point where you will achieve an exceptional amount of progress. And then beyond that, you will still achieve some progress, but it will come at the cost of overtraining symptoms or high amounts of fatigue, and you've just got to ask yourself, is it worth it? So what we want to do is kind of get to a point where we are seeing a good amount of progress, but we're not seeing any symptoms of recovery getting in the way, maybe some joint soreness or a lack of lifting progression, for some examples. Now, when we consider training volume, it is based on a couple of things. It's the physical characteristics of a lifter, how strong they are, because you've got to think about how much total weight they're moving, their experience and training proficiency, so how hard can they actually train and how effective can they train, taking those sets really close to failure. Their genetics, so some people can just eat up more training volume than other people. And then we've got our biological sex, which in generally biological females will take a little bit more training volume than males overall, because they've got the hormonal profile to deal with the recovery and the muscle and experience less muscle damage and things like that. Then we move to the things that are more, I guess, fluid, that change day to day, week to week, month to month. and that is the lifestyle characteristics. So their diet, their sleep, their lifestyle stress, which is their work commitments and their personal life, and then their supplement status. So are they using PEDs? Are they not? All of these things will give us an idea of how much total training volume a lifter can use. So the things we need to consider with training volume is generally most lifters will fall between 60 and 100 sets per week. If you're here and you want a number, I can't give you something that's really specific, because you can experience growth doing 60 sets per week. You can experience it doing 100 sets per week. There's people that fall outside of this. It is extremely hard to give you guys an X amount, but hopefully by the end of this, you guys will get a bit of an idea of where you guys need to be. What's more important than everything is you should have data in your plan that gives you clues on whether you escalate or de-escalate your training volume. And that's your symptoms of recovery, your desire to be in the gym, your sleep, your desire to be within the workout. Could you do more? Do you want to stop halfway through? All of these things give us little bits of clues on, are we doing too much, or are we not doing enough? Or is there some things outside of the gym that we need to, kind of plug? Are there holes outside the gym we need to plug with our recovery so that we can get that adequate amount of training volume in? Now, once we've thought about that total training amount for the week, we need to think about the volume distribution. So depending on which body parts need priority, your volume will be allocated accordingly in most cases. So we use general landmarks. Again, this is very individual, but usually around 5 sets upwards of 15 training sets, which are hard sets taken to failure to get a stimulus per week per muscle group. In a lot of cases, will yield the result that we want. So in a lot of cases, muscles that are needing more development generally get a little more volume, providing that we've ironed out the technique side of things, because there's no point in doing more volume on something that people are performing poorly. So let's say perfect world, we've ironed out the technique stuff. This person now needs more focus on a specific area. We're going to send a little more training volume to that specific muscle group, whilst others are going to take a backward seat for a bit. So we might maintain something like someone's lower half if their upper body needs more development. So they'll do a minimum amount of sets for that. So that could be anywhere from say 3 to 6 sets per muscle group on the hamstrings, quads, and the glutes. And then we send all of the other remaining volume distribution to the upper body across the board, for example. So looking at this as an example of distributing training volume across the week, you've got 80 sets here, then you've got like a lower amount of training volume. Maybe this person's a really proficient lifter that lifts heavy loads and close to failure. This one's like an intermediate lifter that still trains really well, but probably needs a little bit more training, just overall for their goals. If we look at the distribution here, it's heavily towards like the back, the glutes, the back, the lower body, and the delts, which gives you a little bit of an indication that it could be someone who's looking for like that bikini body type development. And then you've got this particular group here, or this particular distribution, which is more towards the back, the shoulders, and the legs and arms, kind of more evenly distributed. So this could be someone who's looking for more general development, but more specifically towards like the back and the delts. So this is essentially what we're after. I said this to someone the other day. It's more like a pizza. Your total training volume, so how big the pizza is how much volume you can do, and then the slices and how big those slices are is each muscle group, and you get to decide just how much of a piece of that total training volume you give for a specific muscle group. The one thing we can't get caught up on is doing more for everything. If we push the needle in one direction, something has to take a backward seat, because that's when we run into the risk of overdoing it overall and training too much, and just doing everything really poorly. So now we need to think about rep ranges. So rep ranges for hypertrophy are generally really broad. Research suggests that our rep ranges are between 3 reps and 30 reps plus, which gives us so much scope to work with. Now we need to make sure obviously we're training to a sufficient proximity of failure. So 1 to 2 reps to failure, sometimes to failure, but not always. So if we look at this diagram here, it's like we can experience muscle growth across lots and lots of rep ranges. We typically use 5 to 15 reps for most movements with our clients, but as always, there's exceptions to everything. So the one thing I wanted to express here visually is this is why we would use this 5 to 15 rep range more so, because typically we get enough reps in at about 5 reps to make it stimulating, give that muscle enough tension. And then when we go upwards of like 15 reps, about say 40 to 50% of that first part of that set just isn't stimulating enough. And then by the time we get towards the end of the set, which becomes more stimulating with the size principle and recruitment and all that stuff, that if we go anywhere above this, like there would only be extenuating circumstances where someone is really, really strong and we're trying to limit the load, or we're trying to maybe work on their muscular endurance, for example, as well as trying to build muscle, that we would go beyond that range. Or maybe an exercise isn't very loadable, so can't add lots of weight to it. So the way to progress it is add more reps. Then we would use those scenarios where we would escalate the rep range. So generally we just sit between here, but it's not concrete as always. It's just so many variables to think about. Now we move to exercise selection. Now the considerations here are pretty clear. The exercise must place tension in the desired muscle group or groups that you want for yourself or whoever you're working with. The movement has to be repeatable and allows for high levels of effort. So we want that standardization of technique, and we want to make sure that that person is training close enough to failure to get that maximum recruitment and obviously get that stimulus that we're after for growth. We need to make sure that that muscle receives some form of feedback post-lift, that it's being used. It's super important because it gives us an indication that we're doing it properly and we've selected the right exercise. And then there needs to be progression in the exercise for the lifter themselves. They need to know that there's progression to be made. If a lifter doesn't think there's progression to be made within the program, the way they approach that exercise is nowhere near as good as if they feel they have progression in it. And that's a super important thing, more from like the psychological side, but it is super, super important to performance overall. And then the last one, which is still super important, the lifter has to have access to the equipment. There's no point putting a hack squat in, regardless of how good it is, to emphasize quad stimulus if the person doesn't have a hack squat. Now, in almost all cases, a mix of compound and isolation exercises are going to work best for most of you. This is still based on that needs analysis though. So we still want to have these compound multi-jointed exercises to get stimulus across a wide variety of muscle groups, but then there still needs to be a degree of precision that we select with these exercises that isolate specific muscle groups in specific areas to build the physique that that person either needs or desires, as like we spoke about before. So now thinking about exercise order within that session, we have basically two options. We want to start with the most important movement of the program or the exercise. So let's say the emphasis is on the chest. We're going to put the chest at the start of the workout because we don't want to put it at the end where we're going to be fatigued, because then it becomes not as effective. Because as you can see here in this diagram, as the workout goes on and as fatigue starts to surmount, workout performance starts to drop. So if we look at this example here, these sets at the start are more anabolic than the sets at the end. It doesn't mean there's no anabolism happening at the end of the session. That's not true. There's going to be an effect. It's just the maximal effect is going to happen at the start of the session. So we want to make sure that those movements that we're emphasizing in this training block are done at the start of that particular session. Now, the other consideration you have for your exercise order is the most physically demanding movements, maybe the most complicated, the most loadable, the most heavy movements within that session, the ones that have high levels of risk that we don't want to do with fatigue. You maybe would consider doing them at the start of the session. So you've essentially got two options and two directions to take with your exercise order. So now the last consideration that we're going to talk about today is how long should a training program go for? Now this is highly individual, but in a lot of cases, people don't spend enough time on the training program. They spend between this week 1 and week 4. Typically, if you're not a really experienced lifter who knows their weights and can train really hard, you are typically only training skill and coordination for these periods. And then when we look at a training length that happens at around 6-week mark, most of these people will find somewhat of resistance to that linear progression at a 6-week mark, and then they'll want to change their training program. Now, usually what we'll do with those people is we will find a reason to why that person is experiencing some form of a plateau, for lack of a better term, and keep pushing them through. And most people will experience an increase in training performance and results because they push through that plateau and they're actually training at this week 8 mark at an effective level of effort that is going to yield an adequate stimulus. So it's not always the case. We do know that there are lifters that can work really proficiently from week 1 and probably experience some results with like a shorter program length. But in a lot of cases, between 8 to 12 weeks is the most preferential time frame for a training program to build a body. So that's all we're going to talk about for today, guys. I hope you like this educational style of content. Let us know if you want to see more of it in conjunction with all of the other videos on the channel. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, check out our bio for all of our other media, and we'll catch you next time.